water, fire, and earth. Elements of creation. Elements of destruction. These are the forces of nature's fury. Australia is on the edge of the world's most dangerous seismic and volcanic zone. A crack in the earth that rips around the Pacific. Destroying cities.
So there's always going to be a risk if you go that close to a volcano that you may lose your life.
Exploding a reborn Krakatoa volcano.
Nothing is precious as human life.
And now it may even be threatening down under.
So there could be a volcanic threat to an Australian city.
This is the Ring of Fire.
So around the area of Australasia, we have an area very active of volcanoes and earthquakes. And this is because there, the tectonic plates is all part of the Pacific Ring of Fire around the edges. So you've got New Zealand, Vanuatu, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia. All these areas sit on the edge of where these tectonic plates are coming together, colliding, and one going down under the other. And that's why we have a lot of volcanic activity around the edge of Australasia and Australia.
Volcanologist Professor Heather Handley explains why these isles are on one of the most active tectonic fault lines on the planet.
I think they're just the most intriguing and fascinating aspect. And, you know, for thousands of years, people have made up myths about volcanoes, and they've influenced cultures, they've changed societies, they've wiped out societies. Volcanoes are so powerful, and I think it's their influence on the fertility they give to the soil, the damage and destruction that they cause, and the fact that we just can't control these things that made me want to learn more about them, how we can understand them, and what goes on underground where we can't see.
The volcanism has been a positive thing in that it creates land. A lot of Japan, a lot of Indonesia, the land there is actually created by these volcanic events. There's very, very fertile soil associated with this volcanism, but it also comes with the caveat that these are massive potential disaster risks.
Associate Professor Craig O'Neill from Sydney's Macquarie University sees the Ring of Fire as being one of the most powerful natural forces on the planet.
So the Ring of Fire is a line of volcanoes that traces out the edge of the Pacific Plate. So the Pacific Plate's one of the biggest plates on the planet, and it's moving towards the west generally. And when it does so, it encounters other plates, and being an oceanic plate, it tends to sink down underneath them. So that causes massive earthquakes the entire rim around the Pacific. So that's responsible for the earthquakes that occur in New Zealand, all the way up to Tonga, then across to the Philippines and up to Japan. Now, when the plate actually goes down, though, it drags water with it. And that water, when it's in the mantle, tends to drop the melting point of the mantle and create magma, which then forms this line of volcanoes a little bit back from where the plate's actually sinking back in. And that's what gives you these volcanoes around the Ring of Fire. So between the two events, though, you have this perfect storm where you've got this capacity for massive earthquakes occurring as the Pacific plate sinks down into the mantle, but you've also generating these really volcanogenic fields where you have, a high density of volcanoes just back from that.
And there are few places on the Ring of Fire more tectonically active than the archipelago of Indonesia. Home to more than 250 million people. But in 2018, an island in the middle of Indonesia known as Anak Krakatoa, meaning the son of Krakatoa in the local language, was to rear up from the deep and launch a two-punch killer blow. The latest explosion in a long history of destruction for Krakatoa, the world's most famous volcano.
So Krakatoa Island was actually a volcanic island that occurred before 1883. And it had probably 3 different vents that were active in volcanic eruptions. And then in 1883, there was a large volcanic eruption, and most of that island actually disappeared and collapsed into the water. The Krakatoa eruption was a very large eruption for its time, and the noise from this eruption was heard a long way around the world. And it occurred at a time when communication networks were just developing around the world, so there was a lot of interest in this eruption. After the 1883 eruption, it created a big hole underneath the ocean called a caldera, which is just a big cauldron or hole in the ground. And on the edge of that caldera, Anak, or baby Krakatoa, began to grow. So over time, it grew up under the water until eventually in about the 1920s, it reached the surface. And there we saw lots of explosions, and we saw these kind of interactions with the seawater, these big explosions and plumes. And then it started to grow into a new island. So baby Krakatoa is a new volcanic island that represents the activity that's ongoing at Krakatoa at the moment.
Australian television journalist Anne Barker is a foreign correspondent based in Indonesia. She was an eyewitness to 2 of the Ring of Fire's most devastating disasters, though she experienced Krakatoa years earlier at a more peaceful time.
I did actually climb Krakatoa once, and like 20 years earlier as a backpacker, you could see hot rocks coming out of the volcano. It's been getting bigger and bigger every year. And, if you'd told me then on that day that this volcano would one day collapse on itself and cause a devastating tsunami, I would have struggled to believe it, but clearly that's what happened.
So I went to Anak Krakatoa and I stood on the crater rim of the bit that's still remaining now from the mass that went into the sea. And it was an amazing opportunity to stand at one of the world's most famous volcanoes. And we saw a big volcanic bomb. So this is a big piece of rock that was flown out, super hot red, flying through the air and landed. But we could see the size of this, and it was just so impressive to think that if you stood there when a volcano eruption is happening, that this thing could actually kill you. I think it's just an amazing place to see the Earth at its best. So humans spend a lot of time trying to control everything around us. And volcanoes are just proof that no matter what we try to do, you just cannot control the Earth's power.
Øystein Andersen is a Norwegian filmmaker who was lured to the mythic Isles of Indonesia by its volcanic landscape, which he wanted to capture on film. Little did he know this infamous volcanic force would come to threaten his family.
When we're filming, you feel like you are documenting history. it feels like a good thing to do.
Oystein was to capture the wrath of Anak Krakatoa on film as it launched a lethal explosion that was to kill hundreds.
So we know from visual observations, so people actually watching the activity, and also from the monitoring of that volcano, that there was an increase at Anak Krakatoa in volcanic activity from around June in 2018. So when the increased activity occurred in December, there was explosions and lava coming out, and it could be seen visible from the mainland that you had this bright glowing red lava coming down the side of the volcano.
You could see the lava from such a distance, but also hearing the sounds, the booming sounds of the volcano.
After months of rumblings, this was the main event. Anak Krakatoa was exploding. The island around the volcano was collapsing and setting in motion a catastrophic event far more destructive than Anak Krakatoa's lava explosion.
So then what happened was part of the side of the volcano collapsed down into the ocean and pushed the water and created this tsunami, this wave of water that was moving towards the mainland. In deep water, it's not very high, but as the land gets shallower towards the coastline, the wave height gets a lot higher. So when this wave reached the mainland, it actually then destroyed buildings. Over 400 people died in this eruption.
This wave was the deadly Anak Krakatoa tsunami. A tsunami is a form of destructive wave that mathematician Shane Keating describes as being very different to a normal surfing wave.
Groundswells are very different from tsunamis. Groundswells are generated by storms, whereas tsunamis are generated by seismic changes in the ocean floor, for example, caused by earthquakes. When a tsunami occurs, it has an enormous wavelength. That is, the crests between tsunamis are very long, and they travel extremely rapidly across the ocean. We don't experience them as a wave, however. Instead, what we experience them as is a very strong high or low tide. That's what gives rise to the original name for tsunamis, a tidal wave. So when you think about a wave to surf, you don't think about a tsunami because you don't surf the tide. Some of the confusion for that comes from the image that's used for tsunami evacuation signs. If you look at a picture of a tsunami evacuation sign, it kind of looks like a breaking wave, but that is nothing like what a tsunami really looks like.
So as the wave comes towards the shore, because it gets shallower, the wave height gets bigger. So when it comes on the land, it can travel inland and actually then damage people and homes and the environment. So this wave that came in took people by surprise. So there was no warning system of the tsunami coming towards the land. So people did not have much time to actually clear the land near the sea and get to higher ground.
Well, I was standing filming Anak Krakatoa when the tsunami struck. The first thing I saw was suddenly a wave approaching me at the beach. I was just standing 4 or 5 meters from the sea itself. So I saw the wave when it was quite close to me, so I just grabbed the camera and run inland. What should I do now? And I thought, okay, I just have to go back to the place I was staying and get my family and evacuate.
I mean, look, you only have to watch one video to realise how completely unexpected that Krakatoa tsunami was. There was a pop band that was playing one night at Tanjung Lesser, I think it was, somewhere on the coastline there. Literally, as the waves struck, the band members were just washed from the stage inland, along with half the people watching it. It's just the most shocking video that you could see anywhere that shows the impact of that tsunami.
The tsunami waves were in places 2-3 meters high and destroyed houses, small shops, and hotels.
You just saw people who were living kind of along the rubble of their own homes. We talked to one man who had been living or sleeping in a house right near the waterfront. He was asleep with his wife and children sort of in the afternoon and suddenly realised that there was a tsunami. He tried to grab his children. I think it was a child of 3 and a 22-day-old baby, and he just couldn't find them. He and his wife managed to get out, but the children were so small that the waves just kind of washed them away, and they just could not find them at all until afterwards. He was absolutely distraught, as you can imagine. I mean, it's just that dreadful raw grief. Even a week later, he could barely speak to us through the grief and the guilt, presumably, that he would have felt from losing his children.
Fortunately, Oystein was able to get his family to higher ground, and they survived the tsunami.
On the night of the tsunami, the locals were very, very helpful. Me and my family were taken really good care of after we had to go into the forest. I really appreciate the way they treated us.
My understanding was there were about 430 people killed. That was the sort of death toll given in the days or weeks after that tsunami.
In Indonesia, at the time of the Krakatoa eruption in 2018 and the tsunami that was generated from that, there was no warning system in place. They did have a warning system that was to detect earthquake-generated tsunamis, but that hadn't been operational since 2012. But even if it had been operational, they wouldn't have detected this type of tsunami because it was generated by a volcanic eruption. Because of the high-level activity of this volcano and its past eruption record, there is chance in future again that this volcano will grow back up above the ocean again. And then in the future, because we're still in the situation that this volcano, this baby volcano, is on the edge of what's a big caldera, a big hole, it's always going to be susceptible to collapsing or falling into that hole and generating a tsunami.
As destructive as they are, volcanoes are also agents of change, turning over the Earth's land to bring new fertility to the soil. Volcanoes can also sleep, dormant for centuries, and these sleeping giants rest uneasy across Australia, which lays just behind the Ring of Fire.
So in the past, since the time the dinosaurs died, we have actually had a lot of volcanic activity down the east coast of Australia.
The areas Professor Handley is talking about are in southeastern Australia, just outside the major metropolis of Melbourne in Victoria, where more than 4 million people could be at threat of these newly discovered volcanoes. It's a region known as the New Volcanic Province, and Professor Heather Handley has been at the forefront of research in this area.
So the volcanoes that we get in Australia, they're not single volcanoes that you imagine a volcano to be. They're actually active fields. So it's an area of land that's considered still active where a volcano could erupt. So for example, there are over 400 volcanoes in the area in the southeast of Australia in a field that's been active for the last 4.5 million years. And the last eruption was about 5,000 years ago. So even though this seems quite a long time in terms of, I guess, a human life, this is nothing in terms of geological activity. So it's been active for the last 4.5 million years, and there's a very big chance that something again will happen in the future. So the chances of an eruption in Australia are very small. So this is very different to those situations where we've got very active tectonics with earthquakes and volcanoes like around Indonesia or subduction zones. But there is still a small risk that we could see another volcanic eruption in Australia. So this could be a small eruption, or it could be a relatively large eruption. So sometimes when these eruptions come through, the magma or molten rock comes to the surface and interacts with some groundwater or surface water, they can cause quite explosive volcanic eruptions and some ash into the atmosphere. Or they can just ooze up and come out, a bit like what we see in Hawaii. So in Australia, we could see another volcanic eruption on the mainland, but it may happen in a week, it may happen in a year, it may happen in 5,000 years. We just don't know. But if it does happen, we might only get a few days or more to actually know that this eruption is going to happen.
Volcanoes aren't the only tectonic force that could destroy an Australian city.
So within Australia, we do have a tendency to be quite blasé about the seismic risk because it's not in our face every day like it is if you lived in New Zealand along an active plate boundary. But we still do have seismic risks in Australia, and in many ways, the factors that gave rise to the Christchurch earthquake, such as unmapped faults, those exist in Australia as well. For instance, under the Sydney Basin, we've got a lot of sediment, but beneath there are fault lines that were previously active. Some of them may become active again under the right stresses, and case in point would be the 1989 Newcastle earthquake, which was only a magnitude 5, but it occurred in a city, Newcastle.
While volcanoes and earthquakes may appear overwhelming in their destructive threat, making use of any warning time is vital to save your life and that of your family when one of these disasters strikes. As survival expert Kai Furneaux explains.
In a natural disaster, the thing to remember is that nothing is precious as human life. So you may think that you have stuff that's worth saving, but at the end of the day, if the order is to evacuate, the important thing to save is yourselves. There's no one grand rule about what to do in the aftermath of a disaster. You need to assess your situation and plan according to whatever natural disaster has hit you. Most of the time, authorities will give you leave to go back to your house. Don't go back until authority has been given. And remember that in the aftermath of a disaster, things are not going to be the same. So there'll be power lines down, flood debris that you can't see through and under. There'll be structural damage possibly to your house. Be cautious, Make a plan. Know that you may well be dealing with your own situation for 3 or more days. You might not be able to get outside help, so you're assessing your situation according to whether you have food, water and shelter. These will be your priorities in the aftermath of a disaster.
At the other end of Indonesia is the dragon-shaped island of Sulawesi. Here in 2018, the Ring of Fire cracked at one of its hundreds of fault lines, creating an earthquake that would generate a killer tsunami. In the local city of Palu, on the morning of September 28, 2018, few suspected a tsunami would engulf thousands of lives, or that it would be preceded by an earthquake that would collapse much of their city.
Palu punya sejarah.
Palu has a history of getting hit by tsunamis.
Tapi memang saya tidak pernah berpikir sedikit pun bahwa
But I never thought Palu would be affected by such a disastrous tsunami, like the one on September the 28th in 2018.
Ruslan Tahir Sangaji is a family man and journalist for one of Indonesia's biggest newspapers. Ruslan was living in Palu when the earthquake hit, and its attack struck directly at his family.
It was huge. There was no gap between the earthquake and the tsunami. The tsunami hit as soon as the earthquake happened.
With the Sulawesi earthquake, there was a tsunami warning that was put out and in place for maybe half an hour. And for some reason, it was lifted. That warning was lifted, and it was only then that the tsunami actually hit.
The earthquake tsunami was a 1-2 punch that was killing hundreds in its first waves against Palu. And Ruslan had no idea as to the safety of his wife and children. He had to find them.
Saya baru mengetahui ada tsunami.
The tsunami hit about 8 or 9 p.m. That's when I went to search for my second child, who I thought had died in the tsunami.
Saya sempat ke pantai di sekitaran pantai Teluk Palu.
I went to the beach where they were collecting dead bodies. I could see dead bodies everywhere.
I think I was probably the first Western journalist to get to Palu and Donggala, which were the worst areas hit in that earthquake. We met people who'd lost their families. In fact, there were a couple of bodies still floating in the water because we were there so soon after it had happened.
No matter what the situation he was in, I had to find my son. That's what I was thinking when the tsunami hit.
The clock was ticking. Ruslan had to find his son. Survival expert and former military operative Joanna Harmdorf has some life-saving tips to survive extreme events like tsunamis and volcanoes.
You don't have to be a full-blown doomsday prepper or a survival expert. A lot of things that will actually help you the most is stuff that you can prepare and you only have to do once. You can buy bottled water that lasts for years. You can buy tinned food that lasts for years. A med kit will be good for years. If you live in the same place, you only have to take your kids through evacuation points once, and then again when you move. That doesn't happen that often. So it's not that extreme as that it sounds to think about your survival and your prepping, because natural disasters are more common and they're going to be more extreme.
When it came to survival for the tsunami's victims, they were helped by Australians who flew over to Sulawesi to assist in the rescue work during the aftermath, like Australian aid worker Calvin Fan.
We're still in Palu on the ground. We are just here assessing the situation. If you just pan around, you can see there's huge devastation after the earthquake. This is one of the biggest places that we're hit. We're here with some locals. The sister on my right, also with Sister Harti. Her house is actually across over here. She was one of the victims, her and her family. They made it out safe. No one was injured or presumed dead. There are still people in the rubble.
So I went to Sulawesi, specifically in Palu, after the earthquake disaster. I was part of the aid relief.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We are passing by the tsunami-affected area.
President of the New South Wales Indonesian Community Council, Endi Dharma, also helped arrange aid for the victims of the Sulawesi tsunami. And the scale of the event deeply affected him as he met with the survivors.
Palu Donggala Sigi, bencanamu adalah bencanaku. Derita tangismu.
For that disaster in Donggala and Palu, anything that happens over there, the feeling happens for all Indonesians.
Jeritan dan kehampaanku.
Alhamdulillah, so at this point in time, we're actually aiming to get these trucks, which is full of distribution and immediate emergency relief, to villages that are living up about an hour to 2 hours away, up in the mountains of Palu. On our way here, as you can see up on top, and scrolling all the way down, we've just hit a bit of a blockade, which is landslides from yesterday's night's rainfall.
So when the earthquake struck, the tsunami also hit. The landslides happened as well up in the mountains. So you had 4 different events simultaneously at times. And in addition to that, there was a liquefaction that actually happened in result of the earthquake as well.
Aid worker Endi Dharma worked right in the middle of this overwhelming destruction.
Mari kita lihat
Just after I got off the plane, I wanted to go directly to the disaster area. I saw terrible things. It was so sad.
I mean, we were, I guess, frightened that we could be victims as well. We were told by our guide that during that time when the tsunami occurred, the early warnings went off, but given that the people on the beach actually had a festival during that day, when the tsunami struck, the people that were celebrating were still walking along the beach and just had no notice of the early warning signs. And so they were, I guess, taken away as well.
After dark nights of searching, fearing that his children had been killed by the tsunami, local journalist Ruslan was reunited with his son. All his family was safe.
I felt so happy when I met him. I hugged him and took him back to my car, and I said, "Let's go home."
senang lah, pokoknya saya sangat senang. Gitu. Nah, senang saya itu dengan terharu ya, terharu.
I felt so happy and grateful that my child is safe. Tears came down from my face, even though I tried to hide them from my children.
Anak saya itu. Kontribusi tidak bisa ikut.
I was very lucky that I got a second chance to live.
For Australian journalist Anne Barker, the failure of the emergency warning system was directly to blame for possibly thousands of unnecessary deaths.
There were a lot of questions about why this tsunami warning had been issued and then lifted, why it had not been issued earlier, and it's something I think Indonesia has been sort of under pressure to repair a lot of these devices since then.
Even if the warning system had worked, a catastrophic side effect of an earthquake known as liquefaction, where the ground turns to a muddy quicksand, would still have killed hundreds.
So the liquefaction that happened, houses were moved about 1 kilometre to where they originated from. And essentially they were just surfing in the mud. And the occupants of the houses were fending by clinging on to the roofs of the houses just to make sure that if a big mudslide was to hit and smack the house, that they had some form of escape and shelter.
I mean, look, I remember meeting one woman who had lost her husband. She, I think, said that she and her husband had tried to run as soon as the earthquake happened. They tried to run out of the house into the street, and she lost him very quickly. He'd gone, he vanished, she never found him again. She said she still didn't have the heart to tell her son that his father had been killed, and she had wanted to wait till his body was found, that she could be certain he was dead before she told him.
The destruction by these primal tectonic and volcanic forces is tragic, and a volcano that lies between Krakatoa and Sulawesi is a chilling example of the global impact these eruptions can have.
So when Tambora erupted in 1815, it exploded, and a lot of volcanic ash and gas went high into the atmosphere. Now, if volcanic material goes into the lower atmosphere, it's often washed out by the rain and it can be filtered out. Whereas this volcanic eruption sent material and gas high into the stratosphere. So when it goes into that level, the sulfur dioxide there actually turns into sulfuric acid when it mixes with water vapor. And that can block out the sunlight and can lead to global cooling. And after the Tambora eruption, it appears that global cooling was very significant. So we know that they called it the year without a summer in the following year in 1816. And it affected crops and it created famine and disease. So there was a huge impact on society, not even close to Indonesia, around the rest of the world after this eruption occurred in 1815.
Some scientists are even seeing a link between increased seismic activity like volcanoes and earthquakes and the effects of a hotter climate.
Look, one of the lesser-known risk factors with climate change is we lose a lot of low-latitude glaciers. So glaciers that are occurring somewhere around the equator, but high up in mountaintops and whatnot. They're going fast, and when they go, they're taking a lot of weight off mountains, and some of those mountains are volcanoes. And so if you remove pressure from these systems, you can both allow earthquake slip to occur more readily, but you're also taking pressure off a volcanic system, which is sitting underground pressurized. So it's like taking the lid off a cannel. Like, those volcanic systems are primed now to go. So we can both increase earthquake activity and volcanic activity due to climate change in these glaciated areas where we're losing a lot of ice currently.
So if you go back to the end of the last ice age, you have this phenomenal change in the planet's system. You had ice sheets going 3 kilometers high. Global sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. The world starts warming up and the ice starts melting, and suddenly you get this incredible increase in sea level. And as a result, it changes the balance on the mantle. And the result is that actually you suddenly start getting these stresses in the planet, which can lead to increased earthquakes or volcanic eruptions.
So we don't really know which volcano is going to be the next big eruption around Australasia. But what we do know is we've had significant eruptions, really large eruptions in the past that have affected a wide area. So in New Zealand, we've had supervolcanic eruptions. And in Indonesia, we've had supervolcanic eruptions. So the frequency is not too often, but if you just go down one to the size of Tambora, these ones, we suppose that we get one of those size eruptions every 500 years or so. We probably will expect another big eruption at some point in the future, but we just don't know yet where.
So one of the problems with the big quakes in particular is they can have quite long recurrence intervals. So it could be 100, 200 years between quake events on some of these fault systems. So that's longer than a human lifetime, and humans become quite blasé about a risk that they don't experience in their own life.
There are over 800 million people in the world that live close, which is within 100 kilometers of an active volcano at present time. So within 100 kilometers, you might be exposed to volcanic ash. And if you live closer, you might be exposed to things like pyroclastic flows.
Australia and New Zealand have always experienced extreme events. There's no doubt about that. As we look back in the past, they've happened. But as the planet gets warmer, as we emit more greenhouse gases, we're seeing an increased intensity and frequency of extreme events.
I think it just drove home how forceful Mother Nature is. I mean, we've all seen on television the aftermath of volcanoes and earthquakes, but to actually see it yourself, it is a shock, as I say, because it's not just seeing it, but you're smelling it, and you're meeting people, you're talking to the survivors, the people who've lost families, lost relatives, and so on. I think it just drove home to me how dangerous the Earth can be, and how much Indonesia, in my case, does seem to get more than its share of volcanic eruptions and tsunamis.
To be honest, I think actually the changes that we're seeing in just the last couple of years are alarming a lot of scientists. I've been working in climate science now for 20 years, and for a long time, the discussion, the debate was very much about what might happen for our children or our children's children. And suddenly there's this recognition that actually it's going to happen and impact, it's already happening and impacting us in our generation.
For Australian aid worker Calvin Fan, the task of putting lives back together continued long after the tsunami ended.
So they've come together as one community. And also, as you can see, just on my left, that's the sort of accommodation they've been staying at.
During my work in Sulawesi, we were evaluating the rubble of the liquefaction that occurred, and as we're walking and just having a look at the disaster zone, our guide turned over to us and just said, just be wary that the military had removed the bodies that they could see and that were visible, but there are still some that are actually buried in the soil. We could be stepping on bodies that were, I guess, been there for the past 2 weeks and no one has even realized. Palu was the first disaster storm I've ever been into. I mean, you see it a lot in the news, you see it a lot in documentaries, you see it a lot, I guess, in the media. But when you're there, it's a surreal experience. You just don't know how to comprehend it.
The expectation then was that they would never be able to find all the bodies buried. It was going to become a mass grave. They would never know the final death toll, and it was expected that really the final death toll was probably going to be in the thousands. In the months since the Palu earthquake, I think I've heard that probably around maybe 5,000 people have been killed. But there's never been a definitive death toll for those reasons, because most of the bodies were left in their homes, in the sinkhole and in the graves.
Here in a remote village up in the Palu Mountains, as you see behind next to me, we're providing some immediate relief after the earthquake and the tsunami.
Yeah, it was a huge community spirit to see that, you know, after all the devastations, and most of them had lost their loved ones, that they were still there to depend on each other and just find comfort in one another, that, you know, that everything will be all right. It's a show that no matter where you are, that when nature strikes, there's no hiding from it.
Ya, kalau bencana memang daerahnya.
The people of Sulawesi understand that because they are living in a fault line, a lot of disasters can happen. And some people believe that these are tests from Allah, from God.
Through the fury and decimation, the ring of fire remains. Perhaps the largest destructive force on the planet. A reminder that we are still very human and very small in the greater scheme of the universe.